And now that we are done discussing the UFC 308 main event between Ilia Topuria and Max Holloway, let's transition into the rest of the card, and we start with the co-main event, the 5-round co-main event, may I add, the Reaper versus the Boogeyman, Robert Whittaker versus Khamzat Chimaev. After another year-long hiatus, the Wolf, Khamzat Chimaev, the undefeated phenom at 30 years old, is back. Well, I'm recording this on Wednesday. I just knocked on wood. It's crazy. Khamzat Chimaev started his UFC career with 3 victories in a span of 2 months, 2 of them in a span of 10 days. After that 2020 year where he may have just been the fighter of the year and was most definitely the newcomer of the year, it seemed all but certain that the UFC would strap a rocket to Khamzat Chimaev's back and send him into the moon that is superstardom. But since that insane 2020, things have not quite been the same for Khamzat Chimaev. First, we go about his first 1-year-long hiatus from September of 2020 to October of 2021, where we saw him come down with a severe bout of COVID-19 that led him to coughing up blood, having very bad lung issues. It was very, very severe and a very, very serious problem at that time for Khamzat Chimaev. But it all was cleared up after a 13-month hiatus. He returned and took on Liang at UFC 267 and got a first-round finish. It felt as if we are finally back on track with the career of Chimaev as he continues to rise through the ranks in a very quick fashion. We saw him return in the spring of 2022, which wasn't quite long, right? October of 2021, April of 2022. That's pretty standard for a lot of fighters. He goes up against Gilbert Burns and has an insane 15-round back-and-forth battle, one of the best fights of that year. We had finally seen Khamzat be truly tested and really go through the fire, face adversity, on the brink of defeat in that fight a time or two, but gets the decision over former title challenger Gilbert Durinho Burns. And then he gets a second fight in 2022, so we really are now churning. It is now 3 fights in a span of October of 2021 to September of 2022, all as well, right? Right? But that takes us to UFC 279. September 10th, 2022 may have just been the craziest fight week in UFC history, where we had 3 different matchups. It was supposed to be Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz, Tony Ferguson versus Kevin Holland, ? No. Tony Ferguson versus Liang, Daniel Rodriguez versus Kevin Holland. I can't even remember at this point. I digress. All 3 of those matchups, poof, gone into the wind. Khamzat Chimaev comes in 178 pounds, didn't even attempt to make weight, and the UFC begins to scramble on that Friday morning. And so instead, we get Khamzat Chimaev versus Kevin Holland, we get Daniel Rodriguez versus Liang, and we get Tony Ferguson versus Nathan Diaz. And it seemed as though, and I remember having this conversation with Noah, Khamzat Chimaev embraced being the villain during that fight week, didn't attempt to make the welterweight limit, went in with just yelling at the crowd, people were booing him. He was a polarizing figure at UFC 279, and he steamrolled through Kevin Holland in just 2 minutes and 13 seconds. But then again, we get another 13-month hiatus for Khamzat Chimaev. So from September 10th of 2022 until October 21st of 2023, he goes without any fights. And now, during that period, I can't quite remember if there were fights that were scheduled that fell through, if there were more illnesses and injuries that came on the side of Chimaev. But it was another hiatus, and he comes into UFC 294, not at welterweight, but at middleweight, and on short notice takes on former welterweight great Kamaru Usman. They fight to a majority decision where Chimaev does come out the victor, but in a very competitive, very closely contested fight. And then he was slated to face Bobby Knuckles Robert Whittaker in June of this year in the very first UFC Saudi Arabia Fight Night card, but instead he fell through again with another severe illness, was in the hospital for a time, and Robert Whittaker instead took on Ikram Aliskerov. But the fight is now here, UFC 308 Abu Dhabi, number 1 contender fight. Number 3 ranked Robert Whittaker, number 12 ranked Khamzat Chimaev, looking to finally right the ship and get all of the momentum that he once had in 2020 and in 2022 back on track as we finish out 2024 and head into 2025. But can Chimaev beat someone who is surging right now in Robert Whittaker, having a bit of a second wind in his career, having won 3 of his last 4 fights, the only loss to Dricus du Plessis, who is the current middleweight champion of the world? And if you want to date back to when he lost the title back in 2019 to Israel Adesanya, he's garnered a 6-2 record. The only other loss was in his rematch against Adesanya in February of 2022 in a very competitive fight that went the distance. And during that time, Whittaker's fought nothing but the best, including Marvin Vettori, Darren Till, Jared Cannonier, Kelvin Gastelum, Paulo Costa, and Ikram Aliskerov, most recently in June. Now, Ikram isn't the craziest of names, but he was an absolutely surging prospect who at that time had only lost to, you guessed it, Khamzat Chimaev. And what does Robert Whittaker do on short notice? He rolls right through Ikram, finishing him in just 1 minute and 49 seconds via knockout. Robert Whittaker had gotten his career on track prior to that with a victory over Paulo Costa, but here solidified himself as a true threat. It was a performance that said, I'm still here. Robert Whittaker, very similar to the previously discussed Max Holloway, 33 years old for Robert, 32 years old for Max Holloway, both of them still in their prime, but both of them debuted back in 2012. Oh, and for fun's sake, both of them 26 wins and 7 losses, all of them against the best of the best in their respective weight classes. But what will we have here? Will we have the undefeated phenom that is Khamzat Chimaev finally right the ship, right the wrongs of all of these past drama-filled years from 2021 to 2023? Can he remain perfect and beat the former champion that is Bobby Knuckles, that is the Reaper, that is Robert Whittaker? Or will Robert Whittaker get the biggest win over the past few years in his career and earn himself a crack at another middleweight title opportunity, this time seemingly to be against either Dricus du Plessis or Sean Strickland? This fight is dangerous for both guys. Robert Whittaker has very good takedown defense. We don't really see him on his back hardly ever if you go back through the resume of his career, whereas Khamzat Chimaev, when he's been in the firefights and been on the feet, which is the specialty of Robert Whittaker, we've seen him face the most adversity there. See the fight against Gilbert Burns, see the fight against Kamaru Usman. If Khamzat Chimaev does not implement his grappling-heavy wrestling game plan, he tends to falter. And yes, he has not lost. I'm not saying that he just loses all control and gets demolished, but that is when he faces his toughest battles. If he has a tough battle on the feet with Robert Whittaker, can he really win that? Especially over the course of 25 minutes, where we've seen Bobby Knuckles thrive time and time again. But if Khamzat Chimaev does get Robert Whittaker down like Dricus du Plessis was able to do, will he be able to continue steamrolling through his opponents, getting another ground and pound finish or another brutal submission finish? That's the question here. I wouldn't say it's your typical grappler versus striker, because I view Robert Whittaker as an extremely well-rounded mixed martial artist. And for Khamzat, yes, his specialty's on the ground, but the guy has hands. See the one-punch knockout that he had against Gerald Meerschaert. What will happen here? Will it be the game plan of Robert Whittaker reigning supreme, or will it be the game plan of Khamzat Chimaev? That is the biggest question for me. Who will have the best game plan, and not only whose game plan is the best, but who will be able to implement it? Give me your predictions here for Robert Whittaker versus Khamzat Chimaev. Who will be the winner, and who will be the next #1 contender for the 185-pound title? Next up in the featured bout is a fight that is supremely under the radar, featuring 2 of the most underrated fighters in the entire featherweight division. It is the undefeated #12 ranked Lerone Murphy versus the #14 ranked Dan 50K Ige. Lerone Murphy made his UFC debut back at UFC 242 in September of 2019, where he fought Zubaira Tukhugov to a draw, but ever since then has tallied off 6 straight victories in the UFC, none bigger than his most recent victory in his first main event spot against Edson Barboza. That was back in May of this year, where he had a very convincing decision victory over the longtime seasoned veteran in 2 different weight classes. That win catapulted Murphy into the rankings in the featherweight division, and he now looks to improve his unbeaten streak to 7 in the UFC with a victory over Dan Ige, who may just be a bigger win on paper than Edson Barboza, especially at this specific point in time, and given the momentum that Dan Ige is riding, even off of a loss. And I mention that loss because we have to head back to UFC 303 in June, International Fight Week, where the stage was set. Diego Lopes versus Brian T-City Ortega, a big-time featured bout on that massive pay-per-view event, and in steps Dan Ige on 4 hours' notice. He steps in for Brian Ortega, who fell ill on the evening, and went the full 15 minutes with Diego Lopes, the hottest fighter and prospect in this entire division right now, and he took him to the brink. Not only did he go the full distance, but he gave Diego one of, if not the hardest fights he's had so far in the UFC, even stealing the third and final round on all of the judges' scorecards. And outside of that 4-hour short notice replacement, Ige's coming into this having won 3 of his last 4, with the only loss to Bryce Mitchell last September, and his last victory was in February of this year, where he knocked out Andre Fili in 2 minutes and 43 seconds. The biggest thing for Dan Ige's career, which has dated back to 2018, let us not forget he is an OG of Season 1 of Dana White's Contender Series in 2017, and this will be his 18th fight in the promotion over the last 6 years, averaging a solid 3 fights per year. Every big fight that Dan Ige has gotten to are the ones that he has lost. See specifically the 3-fight skid from June of 2021 to June of 2022, when he lost to Korean Zombie, he lost to Josh Emmett, and he lost to the undefeated Movsar Evloev. If any one of those losses turns into a victory, there's no telling what his career could look like right now. Look at what happened with Korean Zombie. He goes on to fight for the title against Alexander Volkanovski and fights Max Holloway. Josh Emmett goes on to fight a number 1 contender fight with Ilia Topuria, who's now the featherweight champion, and Movsar Evloev, undefeated, as I just said, and potentially in a number 1 contender fight against Aljamain Sterling at UFC 310 in December. But at 33 years old, both of them, as a matter of fact, 33, they are in their prime right now. Ige has a plethora of high-level experience. Not just those 3 names alone during the losing streak were crazy, but outside of that, you have Diego Lopes, Andre Fili, Bryce Mitchell, Gavin Tucker, Calvin Kattar, Edson Barboza. He has fought the best of the best for the past 6 years in this featherweight weight class, whereas Lerone Murphy is just now coming off of his biggest victory, but prior to that, was fighting some very tough guys for sure, but none that really stack up to the resume that Dan Ige has stacked up. Pair that with Dan coming into this off of a full training camp and not 4 hours notice, I think this is going to be a very, very competitive bout. I believe Lerone Murphy's a pretty sizable favorite heading into this. I somewhat disagree. I may even lay some money down on 50K Dan Ige to get right in the bounce back spot. Next up in the light heavyweight division is a number 1 contendership bout between the number 1 ranked Magomed Ankalaev and the number 5 ranked Aleksandar Rakic. Magomed Ankalaev, let's be honest here, he should have been the guy fighting Alex Pereira at UFC 307 in Salt Lake City, Utah. For whatever reason, the UFC went another way with Khalil Roundtree and placed Magomed here in this fight with Aleksandar Rakic. Magomed has not lost a fight since March 17th of 2018, his UFC debut in a fight that he was winning until he got submitted with 1 second left to the Bear Jew Paul Craig. But ever since then, he is on a 12-fight unbeaten streak. I have to say the word unbeaten streak because he did fight for the vacant title against Jan Blachowicz in December of 2022, but they fought their way to a draw, leaving the division without a champion. So in January, they had another vacant title fight with Glover Teixeira and Jamal Hill. What a time it was for the 205-pounders. But then he fought to a no contest with Johnny Walker nearly 1 year later in October of 2023. But he did right the wrongs of that fight. They had their rematch to kick off the year. It was the first fight night card of 2024, and he finished Johnny Walker 2 minutes and 42 seconds in to the second round with a knockout. And you look at the resume here, wins over Anthony Smith, a finish, by the way, Thiago Santos, Volkan Oezdemir, Nikita Krylov, Jan Kudalaba twice. He's beaten pretty much everyone there is to beat in this light heavyweight division, and somehow, some way, he wasn't standing across from Alex Pereira at UFC 307. While I disagree with that decision that the UFC made, this is the cards that we've been dealt as fans and the cards that Magomed has been dealt as a number 1 ranked fighter in the UFC's 205-pound division. But if he wins here against Rakic, especially if it's convincing, but a win regardless of how he gets it done, should place him in front of Alex Pereira in 2025. And if you're Aleksandar Rakic here, you can not only play spoiler by beating Magomed Ankalaev and ending this insane streak that he's on, but you can come into this off of 2 consecutive losses and launch himself into a title fight with Alex Pereira. in May of 2022. He was in a main event spot with Jan Blachowicz. It was a very fun fight for the 2.5 rounds that we got up until Rakic goes down with a very serious knee injury that put him on the sidelines up until April of this year at UFC 300, where he fought Jiri Prochazka. They were in an absolute war for 8 minutes and 17 seconds until Jiri got the knockout in that second round. A very fun fight for as long as it lasted. Something that really reminded people of how good of a fighter that Aleksandar Rakic is. One of the most high-level kickboxers in the UFC right now. That 2-year hiatus just led him to kind of fall into the wayside and out of the memory of a lot of fans. But he reminded us when he fought Jiri Prochazka. And now, here in this spot, literally getting a bigger fight than what he had at UFC 300. If he wins, he's in. Prior to the 2-fight skid and injury, Rakic was 6-1 in the UFC, and the only loss was a very, very close split decision to Volkan Oezdemir that came back at the end of 2019. So if you look at the calendar here for Rakic, hasn't been the most active over the last 3, 4, 5 years, but this is a big opportunity for him to remind people just how dangerous he is. Only 32 years old, so still in his prime years. If he beats Magomed Ankalaev, what a big victory it would be. And Ankalaev has been on record to even say he would never take down Alex Pereira if he were to get a title shot against him. So I feel like he kind of has something to prove in this fight with Rakic. If he comes in and decides to strike with such a high-level kickboxer and bests him there, whether it's a decision or if it's a big-time knockout, Magomed has certainly solidified himself to be next for Pereira's title. And opening up the pay-per-view main card is about between two very high-level kickboxers on the outside looking in of the rankings in the middleweight division. It is Armen Petrosyan, who is 9-3 with 6 knockouts, taking on the undefeated 14-0 30-year-old Shara Bullet. Shara Magomedov is back. He just fought in August. Prior to that, just fought in June. So this will be his third fight in just a little over 4.5 months. He's coming off of a victory over Mikhail Aleksejczyk and a knockout of Antonio Tricoli before that. And his UFC debut was last October in Abu Dhabi when he beat Bruno Silva. Armen Petrosyan has won 2 of his last 3 fights. However, he's coming off of a submission loss to Rodolfo Vieira in February of this year. So this is going to be a second outing of 2024. Let's see if he can right the ship against someone that is very dangerous in Shara Bullet, but someone that will not look to take him down like the likes of Rodolfo Vieira did and Caio Bahaio, his only other UFC loss back in July of 2022. If these two do stand and trade for 15 minutes or less, I think it's going to be a very, very fun fight. I think it's one that stylistically is kind of getting slept on, maybe just because of the loss that Petrosyan's coming off of, but Shara Bullet has a lot of eyeballs on him, and if he comes in and makes it 4-0 in the UFC, especially against someone as dangerous and as talented on the feet as Armen Petrosyan, he will be fighting a ranked fighter next. The prelim headliner will feature the number 10 ranked welterweight in the world, Geoff Hands of Steel Neal, taking on the number 15 ranked former champion at lightweight, Rafael dos Anjos. If you look at the most recent run for Geoff Neal, having only won 2 of his last 6 fights, it seems as though you're just seeing more red than green, and maybe he's kind of on the outside looking in of his potential at this point in his career at 34 years old. But if you really look into it, it's a fight against Ian Gary back in February that was a split decision. It was a loss to Shavkat Rakhmonov, who's undefeated and fighting for the championship in December. It's a loss to Neil Magny, a longtime veteran of the UFC, the all-time leader in wins in the welterweight division, and it's a loss to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Sandwiched in between are 2 back-to-back victories over Santiago Ponzinibbio and a knockout over Vicente Luque, the first man to ever do that to Luque. And even in that fight with Shavkat, that was the toughest fight that Rakhmonov has ever been in. Geoff Neal was giving him everything that he could handle before getting caught in that submission late in the 3rd round. Geoff Neal actually was on the same exact Dana White Contender Series episode as Dan Ige, Season 1, Episode 3, back in July of 2017. He debuted in February of 2018 and started his UFC career 5-0. As a matter of fact, he's the last man to beat the champion in their weight class, Belal Muhammad, back in January of 2019. So yes, Geoff Neal has ran into some roadblocks along the way in his personal life and in the professional setting of the mixed martial arts cage, but he definitely still has plenty to offer. Just 34 years old, 15-6 overall, and he's now fighting someone who is definitely in the back half right, of their career, the twilight, if you will, of the 39-year-old Rafael dos Anjos, who will be making the walk to the cage for the 49th time of his career this Saturday. The former lightweight champion turned welterweight, turned lightweight, turned welterweight, turned lightweight. You get the point. He's been going back and forth for many, many years now. He has found success in both weight classes, but much more in the 155-pound division. But now we see him again dabbling back into the welterweight division. We've got wins, then we have back-to-back losses. Then we have back-to-back wins, followed by a loss, followed by a win, followed by back-to-back losses. He's lost 3 of his last 4 bouts. The only victory is against Bryan Barberena via submission in the welterweight division. In the 3 losses, it's Rafael Fiziev in a main event that happened in the 5th round, lightweight. It's against Mateusz back at UFC 299 in March, a top 10 ranked lightweight, and it's to Vicente Luque in August of 2023. Now that was a main event spot in the welterweight division. So it's really just been a mixed bag of results for RDA over the past few years, but he still finds a way to get victories and squeeze them out when it matters most, and he can shock people by beating Geoff Neal here, because I think a lot of people are putting him off as the underdog here. The betting odds say as such as well. Geoff Neal, even in losing efforts, has looked damn good. The same cannot be said for RDA. I think this is a really, really hard test for Rafael dos Anjos, an uphill battle, but one that he could pass because we've seen him do it time and time again. And I won't go as in-depth for the rest of the card, but there are some definite fun matchups that I still want to give some shine to and some fighters as well. So we'll go to Mateusz Rebecki and Myktybek Orolbai. Mateusz, 19-2, 16 finishes, been finished in both of his losses. He's coming off of a loss to Diego Ferreira back in May. Prior to that was 3-0 in the UFC with 2 finishes, and Myktybek is extremely, extremely dangerous. He's 13-1-1, 11 victories are by stoppage, and he's undefeated in the UFC at 2-0, a longtime LFA veteran as well. Abus Magomedov is back for the second time in 2024, looking to make it 2 straight victories. Back in May, he beat Warlley Alves and ended his 2-fight skid, which was started by Sean Strickland and extended by Caio Bahaio. Those were both in 2023. And on the other side of the cage is Bruno Ferreira, who is 3-1 in the UFC thus far. The only loss is to Nursultan Ruziboev, and all 4 of those UFC fights have ended via first-round knockout. Kennedy Nzechukwu was coming into the heavyweight division for the first time, believe saving a fight on semi-short notice, taking on the Huggy Bear that is Chris Barnett. That could be wild. Don't know how it's going to go, to be honest with you, but it could be wild. The 12-0 Farid Basharat is the biggest favorite on the card, if I'm not mistaken, around minus 700 or so. He's 3-0 in the UFC, a Dana White Contender Series alum, has 1 finish in the UFC as well. Him and his brother both are insanely talented. 27 years old for Farid, the young bantamweight. He's taking on the 25-4 Victor Hugo. Victor is a 2023 alum of Dana White's Contender Series and made his debut in April of this year with a unanimous decision victory and has not lost a fight since March 22nd of 2014, over 10.5 years ago now. A 14-fight win streak in total. Pair that with the 12-0 record of Farid, 26 consecutive victories for these two. Somebody's victory streak has to come to an end. And we have the 22-1 Rinat Fakhretdinov looking to make it 5-0 in the UFC with 1 draw. To do so, he'll have to take on the PFL veteran Carlos Leal. The former LFA champion Carlos Leal earned his opportunity to fight in the PFL from their Challenger Series, and he competed in the 2022 and 2023 seasons, and in 2024 fought in UAE Warriors and back to LFA, went 2-0 in both of those fights with first-round knockouts. So give me your thoughts on the UFC 308 main card and prelims in the comments below. What are your predictions and what are your bets for this weekend's fights? If you enjoyed this breakdown, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, where every week I break down the biggest storylines and what is at stake for the best fights. I recap the most meaningful results every weekend and give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements. You can join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where podcast episodes release there every Friday and Monday. Have a great weekend, enjoy the fights, and I will see you in the next video.